Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. This video is going to be a showcase of my RTX 3080 test bench, or just my test bench in general. For the sake of some preamble, all of the benchmarks and performance tests you guys saw me do on my channel were all done on my own personal rig. Whether it was CPU benchmarks, overclocking results, GPU water cooling benchmarks, testing RAM at several frequencies and timings, all of that was done on my own rig. While I would have fun tackling these topics and sharing them with you guys, one of the biggest annoyances with these exercises was the fact that it was done on my own personal rig. You see, the important thing to consider when doing these kinds of benchmarks and tests was that it required a lot of specific system configurations and prerequisite setup. This allowed me to do the tests in a controlled environment with specific test conditions, so that I could isolate the GPU or CPU or, test the RAM, etc. The only issue with this is that since it's also my own personal system, I have many other things I do with it as well. Day-to-day computing, video editing, or just being able to play some of my favorite games on my desktop. So this would cause many conflicts for me and intrude in many of my other tasks while I would be working on a certain video and doing benchmarks. Like that one video I made where I was exploring first-gen Ryzen's RAM scaling and having to test 8 different RAM configurations. It was a total pain having to reconfigure everything and then have to set it all the way back up the way it was originally so I could go about my daily business. Along with that, say something messed up in the middle, like when I was overclocking RAM. There was so much trial and error involved, and then having to do stability tests to make sure it was working correctly. Sometimes my BIOS would get messed up and I'd have to clear CMOS and redo everything again. And as this was done on my own personal system, I can't emphasize enough of how much of an annoyance this was, because then I'd have to say, okay, you know what, I'll leave these benchmarks and tests for later, but guess what? I can't actually continue with my system because it still needs to be reconfigured anyway. So it was a huge hindrance on my daily workflow. This is why when I got my RTX 3080, I also decided it's about time I finally built my own test bench setup, so that I wouldn't have to touch my own personal system and mess around with it, then later have to fix it back up the way it originally was. With a dedicated test bench, I can easily conduct many benchmarks and not have to worry about, hey, is this going to mess up something specific with my game settings I had, or what about my previous overclocking setups? There are of course ways to mitigate this by setting up a profile in a program like MSI Afterburner or in the BIOS, but it's just a hassle and I shouldn't really have to go through with. This way I can keep doing these benchmarks and test out all sorts of configurations without the worry of, hey, if something messes up, I won't be able to continue with my work. This also opens many doors for all sorts of other projects I can do in the future, and you guys will see later on, but with this test bench setup, just simply being able to swap around components and such will be very easy, less time consuming, and should just make the overall process much more efficient. For example, in the near future when I get my hands on a Zen 3 based desktop CPU, it'll make it easy to conduct all the benchmarks, then swap the CPU to say an older Zen 2 CPU and then redo the benchmarks and compare them. I really should have done this ages ago, but also keep in mind I don't get any companies sending me hardware for free from reviews or sponsorships, so I have to go out and buy all the parts myself, and you can all probably imagine it's an expensive hobby. But I'm a sucker for tech and PC hardware, so it is what it is. Anyways, let's move on to the content of this video, the test bench which I will be using to review my RTX 3080 graphics card. There really weren't any specific reasons for me picking out these parts, well, except for the case, which I have a lot to say about, but you'll see more about that later on in the video. It was just a matter of choosing the right parts that could work together without any issues and minimize bottlenecks, and really what was just on a good sale at the time or how immediately available it was. Oh, and if you're interested in purchasing any of these parts for yourself or are interested in building a similar system, then check out the video description. Over there, all the parts will have links to where you can buy them. So starting off, we've got the CPU, which is a Ryzen 7 3800 XT. This is an 8-core 16-thread processor which boosts to 4.7 GHz based on the Matisse refresh line from AMD, which were essentially just higher binned and overclocked Zen 2 desktop CPUs. I know I bashed on the XT CPUs and still think they're kind of pointless, but if you can find them for a good deal like I did, where they're not that much more expensive than the original Ryzen 7 processors, then it makes it worth it. As I'm mostly going to be testing at 1440p and 4K, for the RTX 3080, this CPU really shouldn't have any problems bottlenecking the card severely at those high resolutions, as the GPU will be doing like 99% of the work anyways. The CPU will be cooled by a Corsair H115i Pro XT all-in-one liquid cooler. This is a 280mm cooler that should be totally adequate cooling our CPU and thus ensuring we can get the most performance out of our CPU. For the RAM, we've got 16GB of G-Skill Trident Z memory. This is the same kit that I had actually used used in my own personal test system, and out of the box it already comes with tight timing, so it should help out the CPU, stretch its legs out, and allow for easy overclocking, as this is some very high quality B-die RAM we're dealing with. For the motherboard, we've got an MSI MEG X570 Unify. Now, this is a solid motherboard that's loaded with tons of features. First off, it's got a very beefy VRM and a great power delivery setup. A 12-phase VRM setup that's cooled by a hefty VRM heatsink. It's got great memory overclocking support. It's got tons of fan headers to accommodate thorough cooling solutions, 3 M.2 slots, and of course those are PCIe 4.0 enabled, along with the PCIe slots, which should ensure full compatibility with our RTX 3080. Also, this board does have stuff like dedicated power and clear CMOS buttons, perfect to run an open test bench setup. In addition, this board also has BIOS flashback, which is a very convenient feature as I had to actually use it to flash my BIOS, as I wasn't particularly sure if this board came from the factory or retailer, updated to support the Ryzen 3000 XT CPUs. Flashing it was very simple and fast, and it got me up and running to support the Ryzen 7 3800 XT. Also, while I know this might be a negative for some of you, the board has no RGB lighting. It's got a very simple black and gray theme, which I like, and again, I'm just using it in a test bench, so I could care less for aesthetics. So, lots of great features, good cooling, good VRMs. If you're looking for a jam-packed board, the X570 Unify gets my recommendation. Moving on for storage, I decided to keep this as simple as possible for now and went with a large 2TB NVMe drive. This is the Samsung 970 EVO Plus, with sequential reads and writes of up to 3500 megabytes and 3300 megabytes per second, respectively. This is a very fast drive and should ensure fast loading times for all of our games so we can get through the benchmarks as quickly as possible. For the power supply, this was a pretty simple choice. I wanted something with ample power that could accommodate the most power hungriest components on the market, and to give myself some future headroom. As you all might know, these RTX 30 series GPUs are reported to be quite power hungry, and therefore it was essential that I got a high wattage power supply, but not only one that had a high wattage, but also an excellent build quality with top-notch components to handle the toughest loads exerted from the RTX 3080. With that said, the EVGA 1000 G3 seemed like a no-brainer to me. At 1000 watts, 80 plus gold certification, and a premium build quality, this PSU will fit perfectly for our test bench. Let's move on to the case, and boy did this case catch me by surprise. This is the INWIN Aorus. It's a very interesting and unique concept from INWIN, one I can very much appreciate. That's one of the things I really liked about INWIN, is that they aren't afraid of bringing some very cool and unique looking designs for cases that you won't ever see from other manufacturers. Now, what makes the INWIN Aorus so special is that it's essentially an open concept case. There aren't any solid panels that surround the chassis. It's literally just made up of solid trays, mounting panels, and an exterior frame. It's completed by this nice included cloth cover that you can wrap around the case once you're done with your build. So INWIN actually does sell other designs for this cloth, so you can customize it however you want. However, that wasn't the reason why I bought this case. I simply bought it because it actually functions fairly well with a bit of drawbacks as an open test bench. You'll see later in the video with some of the issues I ran into with this build. But initially, I was looking at some proper open test bench cases on sites like Newegg or Amazon, and they were going for some ridiculous prices, north of $150 Canadian, which to me just seemed like an insane markup for what was essentially a motherboard tray with some additional mounts. But as with cases, niche products always have a premium charge. It's why ITX cases are also on the more expensive side, even though technically they've got less materials used with them. I was honestly just thinking, you know what, screw it, I'll probably just use a large table and the motherboard box and call it a day. That was until I saw the INWIN Aorus. For $70 Canadian, this seemed like an excellent deal and would be able to fulfill what I needed from an open test bench. So if you're looking for a cost-effective option for an open test bench, the INWIN Aorus is a pretty good choice. Finally, we've got the star of the show, the RTX 3080. I'll reserve my comments for the upcoming review, but this is what this whole build was catered around. Lots of tests will be run on this build, so I'll be sharing lots of information with you guys, so definitely stay tuned for that. Now that we've gone over all the parts, I'll leave you guys with this quick time-lapse build. Right, you remember how I told you guys, while I like the INWIN Alice, there were some setbacks I ran into with the case? Well, as great as the case is, it only supports a GPU with a maximum length of 300mm, which means for our RTX 3080, which has a length of 323mm, it doesn't fit. It's also my fault for not properly checking specs and measuring, and remember, measure twice, buy once. But I wasn't just going to give up yet. So as you guys can see, the main issue is that the panel the power supply mounts on was conflicting with the GPU. So all I did was I took the panel off from its original spot and ended up mounting it to the bottom of the case where there are 3 mounts for 120mm fans. This of course isn't an official solution, nor does INWIN actually advertise any modularity for this case like that, but hey, I managed to get it working, and with this configuration, the RTX 3080 and longer GPUs will fit on the test bench. I am wondering though if INWIN foresaw this case with dual functionality, that if they had anticipated people would be using it as an open test bench, they could have at least made it so that extra long GPUs would be supported. While we're on the topic of the negatives of this case, well, there's also a lot of wasted space too. While officially this case only supports a 120mm fan on the top or 120mm radiator on the top, and 3 120mm fans on the bottom or a 360mm radiator on the bottom, there could have been a lot more fan mounts on the sides. Also, mounting a 360mm radiator on the bottom of this case just doesn't make sense, as that would also hinder performance of an AIO and could potentially cause it to prematurely fail. You see, for your AIO, you want to make it so that the radiator is at the highest point of the loop, so that any air bubbles that are inside the loop will go inside the radiator and not the CPU pump, as the air can damage the pump. Now, this would be a non-issue for me, as I would have the case laying on its side and not upright. However, the radiator I chose is a 280mm radiator. And originally, I was thinking about just drilling some of my own holes to mount the radiator where the 3 fan mounts are at the bottom, but I had already occupied that space by moving the power supply there. So I came up with this really janky solution and simply zip-tied the radiator to the side of the case. So zip ties were definitely my best friend when it came to completing my open test bench. And hey, if it works, it ain't stupid. But I was also able to get the water cooler mounted in an appropriate position that would allow it to perform optimally, and that was the final component I needed to add. Once I had gotten the AIO mounted, the test bench was complete, and I have to say I really like how it turned out. This should now provide me with a great platform to do lots of tests and benchmarks on, and going forward it'll be easy to get some quick results and then hop on my personal editing rig and put out a video. So that'll do it for the RTX 3080 test bench showcase. Hope you guys liked it, and definitely stay tuned for my review of the RTX 3080, which should be coming in the near future. I hope you guys found this video to be informative and helpful. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description on ways to support the channel and for my other videos. If you guys are interested in more content like this, then make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.